Okay, now let's continue with the general rule of consideration and its exceptions. This is very important, and the question always comes from this topic, this subtopic. Alright, under general rule of considerations, based on section 26, an agreement without consideration is void. If you want to conclude an agreement or contract, you have offer, acceptance, but you have no considerations, then based on the general rule under section 26, your agreement is void. Okay. However, based on this general rule, they also have exceptions to this rule, and the exceptions are based on section 26 subsection A, B and C. In other words, even the contract made without considerations, it is still valid. The contract is not void provided that it falls under these exceptions. Okay, any one of these exceptions. So what are the exceptions to section 26? First, we discuss on the first exceptions under section 26 subsection A. This is under an agreement made on account of natural love and affection between parties standing in near relation to each other. So if the contract falls under this type of agreements, it is still considered as valid even it was made without consideration. However, in order to successfully use these exceptions, there are three conditions that must be fulfilled. First, the contract or the agreement must be expressed in writing. It must be registered if required by any law. And this is very important conditions that must be fulfilled. It is made on account of natural love and affections between parties standing in near relation. What is considered as near relation? It is an immediate family members, the next of kin. But the question here is, what is constituted as near relations? How do we define near relation is? Unfortunately, the term near relation is not defined in our Contracts Act. Usually, some members of the immediate family will constitute as near relations. However, there may be some other exceptional cases and situations. Okay, but based on the personal law, court will look into the customs, okay, and social organizations. For example, in this case, okay, this case is explaining the first exception under section 26 subsection A. In a case of Lee Tan Soh Sim, 1951, the facts of the case, the deceased Lee Tan Soh Sim in her last illness had expressed a wish that her estate to be divided amongst two adopted sons and two adopted daughters. And the legal next of kin. Who is considered as the legal next of kin? They are legal next of kin of Lee Tan Soh Sim. Drew on an agreement renouncing all rights in favor of the four adopted children. So, their aunties and uncles form an agreement in order to renounce all rights in order to transfer the estate in favor of the four adopted children just now. Okay, whether the agreement is valid since it was made without consideration of these four adopted children. This is the issue. So the court considered that Chinese adopted children are related to their adoptive parents and brothers, but they were not related to the family of the adoptive mother. In other words, they are not they are not related to the siblings of their adoptive mother. So in this case, there was no natural love and affection between uncles and aunties to their nephews and nieces, and they do not stand in near relation. So uh, in this situation, their contract is void, so they cannot use the first exception because the uncles and aunties are not considered as a near relation with these four adopted children. Okay, so this decision is based on the Chinese custom. Okay, next. Under the second exception, based on section 26, subsection B, please take note that under this provision there are two exceptions. Okay, so under the first limit, the first exception is the promise to compensate person already done or voluntarily done something, an agreement to compensate for a past voluntary act. This is constituted as past considerations. When you make a promise to compensate person that already done or voluntarily done something, means that your promise is enforceable. With one conditions, promisee did the act voluntarily. The act that has been performed by the promisee must be done voluntarily by him, not based on the suggestions. Voluntarily means that he himself volunteered to do the act. For example, A finds this purse and gives it to him. Later be promised to pay his expenses. So the promise made after A performed the act. So A performed the act voluntarily, so the promise is valid, considered as valid contract. Example of case, how we identify whether the promisee has done the act voluntarily. Okay, based on the case of J.M. Waterspoon and Co. Limited against Henry Agency House in 1962, the issue is whether the plaintiff was a person who had already voluntarily done something. For the defendant depends on the plaintiff's action. So we are going to look into the promisee's actions. The plaintiff in this case had acted on the suggestions of the defendant, so not because of he himself voluntarily performed the act. So it could not be said to have been done voluntarily, and the promise made by the defendant was not enforceable contract. Okay, so he must fulfill the conditions that the promisee done the act voluntarily. Under the second limb of section 26B, under the third exception, it is a promise to compensate person who did an act which the promisor was legally compellable to do. So in this case, the promisor made a promise. He made a promise which he himself was legally compellable to do. Or in other words, he himself has a duty to perform the act, but he transfer the duty to other person. Right. In order to use these exceptions, you must fulfill three conditions. The promise, this is not the promise, the promisee. Okay, the promisee has voluntarily done an act. Second, the act is one which the promisor is legally compellable to do. The act that have been performed by the promisee just now is the act that must be done or compellable to be done by the promisor. And the third condition is it is an agreement to compensate only or in part the promise for the act. Who made the agreement? The promisor. For example, you may refer to illustration D of section 26. A supports B's infant son and B promised to pay A's expenses for doing so. This is a contract. So when we look into this situation, we know that, okay, A is the promisee and B is the promisor. So B actually has to perform the act. He is compellable to perform the act. He must support his own son. However, he transfer his duty to A. Okay, and then he promised to pay A's expenses for doing so. Okay, do they fulfill the three conditions here? Whether the promisee A has voluntarily done an act. Okay, so let's assume that yes, fulfill. So the act is one which the promisor B is legally compellable to do. Yes, and then third, it is an agreement to compensate. So in this case, B promised to pay A's expenses. So the three conditions fulfill, and this is a contract. Okay. Okay. Next, the exceptions under section 26 subsection C. This is a promise to pay statute barred debt. What is meant by statute barred debt? Okay. When it is a debt which could not be recovered due to legal actions because of lapse of time. According to civil law, the limitation period is 6 years from the time of cause of actions. The term within which a party must commence legal actions is limited by statute. For instance, 6 years in according to the civil law for action arising from breach of contract. In other words, the debtor failed to pay the debts within 6 years. So how he is going to pay his debt even without the considerations coming from the uh, what we call from the promisee, okay, or other person who give the loan. Okay, in order to exercise these exceptions, there are two conditions must be fulfilled. First, the debtor make a fresh promise to pay statute barred debt. You must fulfill this condition. Who will make the promise? Who will make the agreement to pay statute barred debt? The debtor, the debtor, not other party. So the promise must be made in writing and signed by the person to be charged or his authorized agent in that behalf. So it must be made in writing and signed by the debtor or his agent. Alright. So once they are able to fulfill these conditions, even the contract was made without considerations of the other party, the promisee, then the promise is enforceable. You may refer to illustration E of section 26. A owes B 1,000 ringgit, but the debt is barred by limitation. So we assume that the limitation period is 6 years in civil law. So A signs a written promise. Who is A? Debtor, right? So he signs a written promise to pay B 500 ringgit on account of the debt. So this is a contract. Even in this situation, there is no consideration coming from B, so the contract is still valid because this is the agreement, this is the promise to pay statute barred debt. As long as the debtor is able to fulfill these two conditions, then the promise is enforceable. Okay guys, that's all for considerations. Please take note on the types of considerations, the rules, and then the general rule and its exceptions. If you have any question, please reach me as soon as possible. Thank you for your kind attention.